Claude Tag is your proactive teammate. What's really special about Claude Tag is it has all of the kind of connectors and tools and context that you're used to when you're using Claude Code, but it's got this extra degree of proactivity and the persistence to see pieces of work through for longer periods of time. Since we've started using Claude Tag internally, our product teams have 65% of their PRs are opened by Claude Tag. And I think there comes a point where it feels like this product is really leaning into like where we see model capabilities today, and it's the one that's really our daily driver at this point.
The AI Native Dev is a podcast for developers and engineering leads at the cutting edge of AI and agentic coding. Join your hosts, Guy Pajani and me, Simon Maple, every week as we chat with the most exciting voices in AI and tackle the biggest questions facing developers today. This is the AI Native Dev. We just wrapped up 2 amazing days at AI DevCon in London.
But the great thing is that we get to do it all over again in New York City this November.
You're absolutely right. We're going to be back in the city that never sleeps on November 3rd and 4th for more amazing sessions, really engaging hands-on workshops, and much more.
Yep, all that great networking, partying, eating and drinking that you've come to expect from AI DevCon. We think we have one of the best hallway tracks in the business, and it's the perfect complement to our incredible speakers and presenters.
We'll both be in person and virtual with live-streamed access to all main stage keynotes and talks.
Sign up right now for our super blind bird ticket for just $100, only available for a limited time.
We're really excited to be headed back to the Big Apple. We hope to see you all there. Hello and welcome to another episode of the AI Native Dev. And it's wonderful and my pleasure to introduce Lamis Mukta, member of technical staff from Anthropic. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey Simon, so happy to be here today.
Amazing. We're going to have a great conversation about agentic coding in general, how Anthropic use Claude Code and agentic development in your environments, and also a massive congratulations for the very recent announcement and release of Claude Tag, which we'll go into in just a second. But Lamis, tell us first a little bit about yourself, your role in Anthropic and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Lamis. I'm a member of technical staff at Anthropic, and I sit in our applied AI team. So this is a team which sits between product, research, and go-to-market. And so we do a mixture of working directly with customers. I tend to work with startups and founders, and we also work on some internal projects with the product and research departments.
Amazing. And we've got a lot to talk about today, but
we do.
Let's start at the very exciting news. Very recently, Claude Tag was announced. You've obviously been using this internally for many weeks now. Tell us a little bit about Claude Tag. What is it and how do you use it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Claude Tag is your proactive teammate, which meets you right where you work in Slack for now. And what's really special about Claude Tag is it has all of the kind of connectors and tools and context that you're used to when you're using Claude Code, but it's got this extra degree of proactivity and the persistence to see pieces of work through for longer periods of time. And like we said, it is able to collaborate with you and your teammates at the same time.
Yeah, that's amazing. And even internally in Tessel, we use Claude Code very, very heavily. And one of the things that we do, which sounds a little bit similar, so I'd love to kind of ask how it differs, is we have an integration of Claude and Claude Code within Slack. So we very often tag Claude to do certain things for us. That's been available for a little while. What's the difference between that, tagging Claude there, and Claude Tag?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question because I think on the surface, these things look really similar, and it's actually some of the more intricacies underneath that differentiate these two products a bit. But I would say, first of all, Claude Tag is incredibly proactive. So it can kind of go and execute pieces of work for long periods of time and then come back and let you know when that thing is done. So it's really leveraging the ability of coding or agents these days to do tasks for very long periods of time. So that's one thing. The second is like often you would kind of go and trigger your agents by asking them questions, and kind of Claude and Slack would reply. Claude Tag will actually like sometimes come and find you and tell you that something needs your attention. So again, there's this element of proactivity. It also has memory and context, which can kind of span your channels. So it can kind of understand what one whole team is working on. And because it's chatting to all of your teammates at the same time, that's something that builds up over time. So rather than you just kind of having these one-off interactions, Claude Tag is able to kind of move out of the scope of kind of sessions and individuals
That's super
interacting
cool.
with Claude.
So it can almost like initiate the conversation.
It absolutely can, yeah.
Yeah, amazing. So the way we tend to use the @Claude invocation or tag within, I shouldn't call it tag, should I? The
You can call it Claude in Slack.
Yeah, the Claude in Slack. So the way we tend to use it is very often we'll start discussing a need or a feature or a bug maybe in Slack, and then we'll maybe @Linear and say we need a ticket about this, and then we'll pretty soon after that just hit up Claude and say, can you just implement this, please? And it will return pretty quickly and say, okay, I'll use the context from this thread. It obviously knows the code base as well. And then it will provide something like a pull request and say, can you have a look at this and see? And then we'll say, yeah, absolutely, this looks good. Merge this and we're good. So there's a couple of changes there. Then the first one is obviously the history there. It sounds like the history, it will know about past interactions across the Slack or beyond. Was that one of the first ones that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on that context point, we have this whole permissioning system with Claude Tag, and you can really control that and tune it to how you want it. But essentially, it's kind of scoped to a channel level. So if this is a channel where you're always talking about feature requests, it has a ton of context on historical feature requests and how, like, what the process is, for example, through skills for seeing those processes through end-to-end alike. So there's a lot of history and context. If configured as well, it can also have the ability to search other public channels that Claude Tag is in. So maybe you have like a customer support channel where there's a bit more context on where this issue arose, and Claude Tag, given the permissions, could also access that information and surface it where maybe you might not even have that kind of visibility. So that's one thing, is just this context window or the memory scope that it has is larger. I think a second is, you mentioned that, do you go to Claude Code to implement the tickets afterwards, after they're done in Linear?
Yeah, I think that's typically the way we use it internally.
Yeah, so I think one thing to surface here is you could achieve that whole end-to-end workflow in just one thread in Slack. So let's imagine in this case, a piece of feedback comes through. In the Claude Tag world, you could have it configured so that Claude Tag actually picks up the feedback first and tags everybody they think should be should be involved in the response to that.
Yeah.
As part of its skills and workflows, it could also then automatically raise the Linear ticket, because that's the workflow that you have configured. And that's available just through kind of prompting and it learning over time through doing that workflow. And then the final thing is, which I think is the real difference, is you no longer need to open Claude Code to go and ask it to execute that. So again, it could just understand that the workflow it needs to do is kind of start coding, so it can spin up its own sandbox. It can start running the code in your repository if you've got access to it, and then it can ping you when the PR is ready. It can also do things like verify the aspects of that meet the original requirements from whatever ticket was raised in the first place. So I think what we see here overall is more proactivity end to end. If you do want it to be able to run that process from kind of ticket to probably asking you if you want it to execute the code first, if you want a human gate there, and then kind of seeing that PR through, prompting people to review it, et cetera, et cetera. It's much more proactive in that sense, and it has access to all the context and memory to do that job well.
And it sounds as well that it's becoming more of the orchestrator as well. So whereas I would need to normally hit up Linear and say, raise a ticket for this, it sounds like if I can just pull Claude Tag in, it can actually do that behind the scenes. And I'm more thinking about the functionality or the feature that I want to change versus the mechanism of the workflow of, okay, let's raise a ticket first, now let's pull Claude in at that stage.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, it's really for individual teams and to think about the degree to which, like where it is in that workflow that they want to steer the agent. So you can be very clear about, like, these are the absolute gates where either you absolutely do not have the permissions to do these things, or I always want you to ask for my input on these areas. And I think what we've seen is, because Claude Tag is able to build up this memory over time, it gets a really good feel for what those workflows look like, and it adjusts. So that's really cool. And I think, just to throw in one last difference on that new workflow, what you'll see if you kind of went and implemented this with Claude Tag is just the ability to enable this cross-functional workflow is really cool. So, for example, like, you have the customer support ticket raised, you might kind of tag some of the account executives that are on that account, just to see if they, like, for their visibility, so that they know what's going on. You can then kind of tag in, loop in your engineers or product people for feedback on some of the product implementation, maybe if Tag comes back to you with a plan, and then have your engineers looped in later when you need that code review to go through and the whole deployment to work. So I think what we see is this, like, multiplayer ability, which has been quite difficult to achieve so far with maybe just working through Claude Code or co-work or something like that. So I think this is where we see some of those effects really multiplying.
Amazing. And there are going to be a lot of listeners who maybe don't use Claude or Claude Tag in their Slack environments today. So it's actually a pretty major change. So when we think about the process change, what are we going from and to? So let's assume people are agentic developers today. How does it change the flow whereby we're essentially living more in our chat environments, more in our Slack, versus potentially our more agentic flows or IDE? How does that workflow change?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things, and just to frame it in terms of the impact that we've seen internally, since we've started using Claude Tag internally, our product teams, like product engineering teams, have 65% of their PRs are opened by Claude Tag.
Wow!
So that's kind of the scale of which, like, we obviously were the early adopters of Claude Code, and now that's like often the port of call for how we would kick off some of these workflows and how those things originate. So yeah, that's how I'd frame it in terms of like where we're at today. In terms of workflow, I think this chat interface is definitely different. I think what it allows us to achieve is when you're using Claude Code. So let's say you're doing agentic development, you have this concept of it's quite single player. So you're often kind of moving into your Claude Code instance, you're potentially like running code locally, and you're kicking off individual sessions. Like we do have this perimeter, which is a concept of a session, and that's where you're kind of stating what you're trying to achieve, managing the context for that, and then you have some kind of like outcomes or goals or loops that you're running. What we have with Claude Tag is it all becomes a little bit more amorphous. So we're starting to like be less session focused and it's less single player focused. So when you're kicking off these agentic coding or just agentic processes with Claude Tag, what you're seeing is that it's so much more multiplayer from the get-go. So Tag can like get the opinions from people that might be needed for a workflow. So rather than me as the developer having to go and ping like some product folks or some sales folks on something, I can get that embedded in the Claude Tag flow. Also, ultimately, all of this work is potentially happening in public, which means that those people have visibility on those workflows from the get-go. They know exactly what kind of product specs the engineer is giving, and can always like chip in if they want to with like extra context, etc. And maybe their own Claude tags are going to like ping these things over to them. So there's this whole like collaborative nature, which is really different. The other thing is, it's a lot more asynchronous than what you'd achieve with Claude Code. So I'd say that with Claude Code, you're kind of, it's great for when you kind of want to be there for every single turn of the agent. Like you want it to come back to you with exactly what it did, anything that needs follow-up, updates, etc. And when you really want to steer that thing more closely, that's a great thing to do. With Claude Tag, we're seeing more of a pattern of these kind of long-running asynchronous tasks. And that's really leaning into some of the model capabilities that have been unlocked with kind of recent iterations of models. And so what you see is like you kind of ping Claude Tag and it comes back to you maybe a couple of hours later having like built end-to-end this feature that you talked about. And so you're kind of able to just leave the agent to itself and it will come back to you when something's done, which is quite different, I think, to Claude Code. I mean, it's inspired by some features that we've released in Claude Code, but that would be how I think things have changed.
And the way the industry is evolving, it's funny actually, about maybe a year ago or so, I was having a chat with one of the VPs of product, I believe, at Slack. And I mused like, is Slack becoming the new IDE of a developer? And it's kind of very interesting when we think about the evolution. You know, developers obviously loving their IDEs, it becoming the most productive place that they're in. Then all of a sudden when we started using, the co-pilots of the world, where we started introducing agentic assistants, I would say, into the IDE, that gradually became more and more evolved with multi-file changes and things like cursor coming in and those types of things. But then as soon as Claude Code really hit the terminal IDE, it changed people's way of working. And I see this as like almost the next shift where it really requires trust. And I'd love to talk about trust for a little while. It really requires trust to actually step away from the IDE, because you're not focused on code, which I think, will be the future space whereby we get to that level of trust where we don't even need to look at the code. But today, I think there's this big shift of, as soon as we're in the terminal IDE, we're actually relying much more on the tests and the validations versus looking at the code or the results from a code review. As soon as that then gets extended beyond and into Slack or a chat environment, we're almost like abstracting away from the code one stage further. I think this kind of a tool, like a Claude Tag or anything from within Slack, this wouldn't have been accepted a year ago, right? But we're so much more trusting of AI doing the right thing, and actually the results of AI generated code and agentic code being reliable, that we're able to use agents from a space which is further abstracted away from a very code-centric environment. Is Slack and chat the new IDE?
This is a great question. I guess it's hard to. I don't think these are like for replacements. Like I think each has their place and their purpose. But I really resonate with this trend that you mentioned in terms of how our behavior, the way that we interact with agents, is changing for a number of reasons. So I think one is that, to this trust point, like one is that models are just getting better and better. Like we are squarely on this exponential trend in terms of how long agents can run for. So the METR chart always shows us that roughly every 4 months, the amount of time that agents are able to run for autonomously is like doubling. And so this is, from a sheer capability perspective, we're able to trust these agents more because of the actual capability that's improving.
I'd love to just double down on that, what you just said. Every 4 months, the time that an agent can do something more autonomously is doubling in terms of, and is that the capability of that model, or is that almost, because there's a human aspect to that as well, right? In terms of, if it goes off and does something, am I able to interact with it? Yeah. Is it pure capability of the model and the agent that's unlocking that?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, and it's so METR produced this research, and it covers a couple of different domains, and essentially time horizons. So that's how long agents are able to kind of successfully complete a task of a certain length, is a measure of capability. It's not perfect. Like there's other evals and benchmarks that we use to measure model capability, but it's one generally broad one that has really mirrored like what it feels like to interact with these models. So the longer that they're able to complete these tasks for, it often is mirroring the fact that they're doing more complicated things. Like they're able to do these multi-step tasks, they're able to verify the results of their work at multiple stages and come back and successfully complete these tasks. So this is one kind of like industry broad trend that we see. Yeah. And it's, I mean, if you look at it, it's just like, it's quite shocking because every time you think that you're not going to keep up with that nice log chart on a straight line, like you just do every time. And that's been happening for the best part of a decade. So this is really interesting. And I think when we talk about model capability, obviously, you know, the amount of time it runs for is one thing, but what we see over time is like a lot of behaviors, which previously we'd kind of put in the harness, are getting embedded into the models. So to make that concrete, models are a lot better at verifying their own work these days. So both from like an instinctual perspective, like they do just check over their own work before coming back to you and saying it's complete. And where they have the tools to verify their own work, whether that's through like front-end tests or running tests or creating their own evals, they're getting a lot better at doing that themselves as well. And so to your trust point, I think these things go hand in hand. Like you give the models the tools to verify their own work, and they are better at kind of doing that themselves. And I think another pattern that we see in development today is that the behavior of the developer or the engineer is shifting much more towards how well can you define what success looks like in your case. And that's not just for coding, that's really for everything. Like, do you have a really good sense of what success looks like? And if so, hand it to the model and it can loop over or have another agent review its work until they both kind of, until the reviewer kind of believes that thing is complete. So I think these are the two things. It's like on the agent and model side, they're just getting more capable and better at doing these things. And then on the human side, like our behavior is shifting more to just like, can we define what good looks like? And I think another thing to just like round that off is that having really like, for a lot of us, having used these tools in anger for like the last year, we're getting a really good sense of like, where are these tools really useful? Where is it that they need a bit more supervision? And we can kind of tune our behaviors and inputs more to like, what makes those things work really well in tandem. So finally to your point on like, is Slack the new home or is Slack the new IDE? I think it's a surface that allows your agents to be closer to where your doing your work all the time anyway. It allows you to tag them in places like anywhere really, like anytime you need more context or you want to delegate something, you're able to just loop the agent in. And sometimes that is a coding task. Sometimes it's like build this feature or this dashboard. Sometimes it's just like, what does this acronym stand for? Like, can you please just tell me what happened last week or something like that? So I think it just allows a bit more flexibility. You're not kind of switching context between working with my agents and working with my team. It's all a bit more integrated.
And it's really interesting when you kind of like mentioned of defining what good looks like.
Yeah.
When we as humans, we always want to use the best tools, the best place for the best task at hand. And in the case of defining what good looks like, when we focus on code, yes, absolutely. We want to describe tests, we want to write some test cases, and we want to build them out. And a lot of the time, we lean into the IDE to actually build that out. But when we want to collaboratively define what good looks like, we naturally find ourselves in a chat environment, and it is the right place to define it. And so tagging something in at that stage, giving it the context of what good looks like is super important. Let's step a little bit back and look more broadly, because I think people who are the power users will look at something like Claude Tag and think, this is exactly what I need. I want to bring this in immediately. So here actually in the Tesla office today, we have a hackathon kicking off, and there's like 150 folks out there. Very, very broad sets of existing adoption. Some people are more new to agentic coding. Others have been using it obviously for a long time. I'd love to ask you about the external adoption of Claude Code from, obviously the broader industry, from a purely agentic coding and development point of view. At what stage of maturity would you say is the industry at in terms of using Claude Code? Obviously, we'll talk about Anthropic's adoption in a second, but externally, how are people mostly using Claude Code today?
Absolutely. And I think we see this in all sorts of like shapes and flavors and forms, from being able to, like for individual pieces of work, being able to complete that to like a higher degree of quality faster. That's something we see on the kind of individual level. And when we scale this to teams and across organizations, we've seen some pretty phenomenal things. Like we've seen organizations, for example, like Stripe, do entire code-based rewrites that would have taken weeks or months in like days or hours. So this is the kind of scale we're talking about when we like really deploy these things at scale and everyone's kind of on board. These kind of ambitious projects that maybe you just like would always put off for like months or years because it's just, where do you find the resource, are finally doable, and that's allowing people to focus on like other parts of like product and engineering work. And we really see this consistently, like other teams like shipping millions of lines, like a million lines of code in just a month or something like that. So I think when everyone kind of like really leans in, that's the scale at which we're able to see development happening. And I think the other thing is you start to see more teams pursuing these kinds of moonshot projects that they just like wouldn't have time, resources, or capacity to otherwise. Like on the product side, something that we see is teams like basically prototyping a couple of different ideas or approaches to something, testing a bunch of them either like with agentic tools or internally, and then just like going all in on the one that they see work best. So there's a bit more room for like experimentation and I guess a bit more like bravery and boldness in the way that you're approaching product development.
And of course, the build versus buy question then becomes super interesting, because it, tools like Claude will make it so much cheaper to build rapidly. You can take an idea or a prototype very, very quickly to an actual live working application. And I guess the question then is if teams want to continue maintaining that over time. And I guess, when we think about what's changing quickly in this industry, is it humans and people that are slowest here in terms of the adapting? Are people able to keep up with the rapid change and delivery that's happening in the AI coding space?
It's a great question. I've been on a bit of a tour around a couple of European cities recently, talking to some like founder communities. And one question I love to ask everyone in the room is like, who here has FOMO that they're not using AI? Like they're not AI pilled enough in their day-to-day work and their life, etc. And it's always just like a full room of hands. And the Anthropic employees as well, we all have our hands up. Like, who can keep up with the pace of this?
And Karpathy famously in his tweet as well said he's never felt more out of touch with something. And if Karpathy's saying that,
I just like ultimately the scale of things, the speed of things is like more than like one human like mind or person can keep up with. Like, I mean, it's more than a full-time job at this point, I think. Sometimes like I even discover features I didn't know that we had because who can keep up with that?
Yeah.
But I think that there's, like, we've talked a lot about the speed and the pace at which these things are developing. And there's another story as well, right? Which is like, well, how much is this translating into actual impact for people? Like, as product developers or builders, like, how are you mirroring that exponential in the value that you're able to deliver to your customers and in the like impact on processes internally? And I think this is the much harder question, and this is the much harder problem to solve. Like, we can have all this raw intelligence, but do we have the infrastructure to kind of bring that value to life? And there's so much that covers. Like, it covers your harnesses and how you're managing maybe your like context and your memories, how you're managing your tools, how you're giving these agents access to everything they need, and also in a secure way. Like, how are you permissioning that? It's something we thought a lot about when we were designing Claude Tag, that specific problem. And then there's everything else. Like, there's all of the infrastructure. Like, how are you going to host and deploy these models? How are you going to deal with all of the inference, essentially? So I think that, yes, whilst it's amazing that there's lots of like shiny, amazing things happening, like those are the problems that like everyone should be really laser focused on. And we always try and like develop tools that help people like really access that value, because on paper it's there, we can see it. But in order to make sure that people really feel that, I think that's like a lot more hard work. And I think it's something that a lot of developers experience.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And you mentioned memories. And I'd also love to chat a little bit about dreaming as well, which is something that you talked about at AI Native DevCon, our conference in London here. And I'd love to talk about that in just a second. But before we do, I talked a little bit about external communities and industry. I'd love to talk about internally at Anthropic now, and how Anthropic develops software itself. And then I'll love to talk a little bit about how Anthropic uses Claude Code generally in the org as well as coding. So first of all, why don't we go back to day zero? Boris is playing around in his basement, building this thing called Claude Code. Take us through that story.
Yeah, so this is like very much like a side project that Boris was working on. And I think there's, first of all, like culturally at Anthropic, there's this real experimental culture. Like, people are always building their own tooling and experimenting with things. And this was something that Boris was working on. And the funny thing is that originally, I think when he shared this in a Slack post, it got like 6 reactions, which always tells you that like you just like, data isn't perfect. There's not like perfect processes for understanding like what good products look like, etc. But a couple of people like saw this and were really excited by it and continued to work on it. And over a short period of time, we saw like amazing adoption within the company, like half of the company using this like weekly. Another thing that's important here, and I think it's a really key principle when you're developing products in this space, is that we saw a real takeoff in the adoption of this product once the models improved a little bit more to make it like really achievable to kind of work on these coding tasks for long periods of time. So like early iterations felt a lot less agentic. It just was more similar to kind of just like getting like chunks of code back through, whereas later it really could start to like access different kinds of tools, work really efficiently over the code base, and like stay on top of a lot of context and stay goal oriented. So one of the big things that we always say to people when they're developing is like, build for where the models are going to be in the future. Don't build for where they are today, because as we've said, these things move so quickly.
Super interesting. There's a couple of things I want to unpack here.
Of course.
So let's jump into the dog fooding first of all. So I think this is a real like dog fooding success story within Anthropic, right? It was documented how popular Claude Code was internally, and how it was realized all of a sudden that actually this is a huge thing, that if our engineers are using this so broadly and getting so much value out of this is something we absolutely need to productize. Talk about how when Anthropic knew this was super valuable and wanting to share this with the broader audience.
Yeah, so I think it comes back to this idea that I think half of the team that time were just like using Claude Code every week, which is quite crazy, like for a new product. I think that sense of internal PMF really made us realize that it was time to release this product more broadly. And it's really the same story with Claude Tag. Like I said, prior to the release, 65% of our PRs are being raised by Claude Tag. And I think there comes a point where it feels like this product is really leaning into like where we see model capabilities today. And it's the one that's really our daily driver at this point. And I think one of the big patterns there is like what happened with Claude Code is at first it was all of the engineers who were relying on this to ship a ton of code really quickly. And then we saw this pattern where all of the teams at Anthropic were like totally going all in on Claude Code. Like there's this crazy story of someone on the marketing team whose day started with like Googling what the terminal was and how to use it. And by the end of the day, they'd like automated one of their workflows, which took them 30 minutes. And now it took 30 seconds. Like they were able to produce these like ads in that short period of time. And so I think what we've seen is like everyone is seeing the power of these tools and is able to kind of creatively find ways to map that to their workflows in different domains that are not coding. Maybe that kind of problem of verification and context is a bit harder. Like you're not set up so well with like neat file systems, GitHub to kind of manage your version control, and like the ability to kind of unit test things. Like you have to be a bit more creative. But I think that that's like where we're all headed, right? Like we're able to kind of set out like outcomes and success criteria or rubrics for like what a good document looks like or what a good briefing looks like. People are, changing their behavior around how they kind of create and produce data and where they store it so that agents are able to more easily access that. So like we have this huge culture at Anthropic where we work really, really publicly in Slack. And so we do that on purpose because it means that our agents can kind of connect the dots in ways that no person could like possibly ever have the visibility over. So sometimes like I was working on, to the extent where I talk to Claude Tag in a public channel, like all of my work with Claude Tag, unless it's something that's really private, I do in a public channel. And it means sometimes people on my team, people like in my company who I've never met will message me being like, I saw you were working on this thing, like I'd love to use it. Like, please can you tell me, like, is that shareable? And like, can we collaborate on this kind of thing? So I think just the ability to kind of connect an organization at that scale is only possible because of the kinds of tools that we have.
Super interesting. And it resonates a lot because even our legal team, for example, build apps using Claude Code, add some skills, check our skills into the TESOL registry.
Love
and
that.
It's like, it's amazing how much that's empowering, not just the engineering community, but the whole organization, which we'll touch in a little bit more depth. I'd love to ask the question about, when there's so much of a dog fooding culture around Claude Tag, around Claude Code in the early days as well, how much is the product direction driven by your internal feedback and the internal dog feeding? Yeah,
that's a really good point. I think this is really important, but I think there's a couple of things to think about here because like quite often with, I think, product development in the agentic era, there's things that on the surface look like an amazing idea and feel like an amazing experience, like single player. But when you really think about what it takes to scale that thing to the enterprise, it's a really different shape of problems. So like in terms of the interaction with Claude Tag, like I think we all knew really early that this was something that was working really effectively. We're also aware that like at Anthropic, we're pretty liberal with the way that we we're pretty generous with the way that we like share information with each other. Obviously there's like some very like strong guardrails there for like what is like strictly private information to a team, but we kind of have all of that set out in our like Slack workspaces, etc. Like we have really good guardrails for the permissioning. And what that means is that within those spaces where that it's like trusted places to share information, people can be really open. And that's what allows our agents to perform really well. So one of the design principles that we had with Claude Tag is just like, we've really carefully designed how you permission each channel. So each channel, the workspaces and the channels have their own permission scopes in terms of what tools they can access, what API keys they have for different services and connectors, and potentially what other channels, et cetera, they can access. So I think like, obviously on one level, we want to kind of share what cultural practices are allowing us to work really well with agents. So one of these is like working in public, but at the same time, make sure that our products come with the guardrails baked in so that you can reasonably achieve this behavior in a way that's not like, that you can actually scale to an enterprise. We think that works really well. Another thing that we did to make this work more effectively is we came up with this concept of agent identities. So one really big difference between Tag and you working with like Claude Code or Cowork is when you work with code or co-work, they kind of assume your own permissions. So they'll kind of work using kind of my API, my API keys or my permission systems, and I grant it access to all those things. Whereas with Claude Tag, we actually give that agent its own permissions and its own keys, etc., so that it can go off and like work autonomously on these things. It's not working on behalf of one individual, it's working on behalf of the team. And it's much easier to kind of audit that. It's not like doing this as you, it's doing this as itself. And so that's another key architectural change that we needed to do to enable this multiplayer behavior. So yeah, I think to round that point off, there's definitely a lot of the kind of product level feedback that all of the teams will chip in with, and will make sure that it really works for different kinds of use cases and different types of users. But at the same time, we think a lot of the work goes into making sure that this is something that actually scales to enterprises and people can really get value out of.
Amazing. And let's talk, I know our audience as well as the industry, the way they improve, the way they get better is through understanding and hearing not just what worked for us, but also how we tripped over, how we failed and had to get up and try and find another path. And I'm sure Anthropic, just like every organization, have areas that they tried and didn't get on with. So I guess from an adoption point of view, or from a ways of working with agentic coding, what were some of your or Anthropic's greatest learnings, would you say, in the way you were using Claude Code, the way you were using maybe even Claude Tag as well?
Yeah, of course. So I think, there's a few. There's like some on the development side and some on the behavioral side. I think on the development side, one thing I said before, like we should always build for like what you think is going to be, like where the models are headed, not where they are today. And one thing that we think about a lot on the Claude Code side is every time that we have a new model, we've discussed kind of how those models themselves become more capable in certain dimensions. And what that means is that we like very regularly revisit what those harnesses look like. And we're very happy to like delete stuff from that harness over time to make it more simple and more lightweight and just let the model do the heavy lifting. So over time, we see something like the harness actually gets smaller because like we can trust the model more with certain capabilities. And we just need what's there to like, give it the tool use and infrastructure that it needs. So that's one thing. I think new model doesn't mean like chuck in like way more prompts and way more architecture. Sometimes it means like less is more. I think another thing is like to reference back to that talk that I did for you guys on dreaming. We, especially working with startups, I get a lot of people asking me about memory and context infrastructure in particular. And, it's not a one size fits all kind of solution. And I think that, people come up with really innovative ways to structure their memory databases or memory structures, etc. And the solution we have in our managed agents API is like a very simple memory file system that just leans on agents' ability to like read and write to memory. And something I touched on in that talk is that we tried a lot of different things in the past, like indexed memory stores or like tools that were very specific about how to read and write to memory. And I think what we learned over time was like this had like a number of problems. Like sometimes we were being too opinionated about how the agents should interact with memory, and they were better left alone, especially as they became more capable to just manage that themselves. And they were great at just using file systems and the native like bash and grep tools. So one thing we learned was like, we could actually just remove some of these abstractions, and even our like being opinionated on the structure of those like memory structures. We realized over time that like indexing it wasn't something that we thought was best practice across the board, and we thought a simple file system was better. So obviously you have to learn these things by trying, and all of these things are very open areas of research and development, and I'm sure we'll find more best practices down the line. But these are a couple of examples where we've kind of tried a few things out and simplified our workflows a bit.
It's really interesting. I'm really curious about the kind of like the context piece, because, or not, sorry, the context piece, but the agentic model changes, and whether it's the agent change or the model change, it really does affect what we actually need to provide it, whether that's context or memory, in order for it to perform the best it can.
Yeah.
And I think what's most interesting is we don't need to change our code or our context in order for us to need to rerun an eval to see, is this actually still valuable in its current state, or because of a model change or because of an agent upgrade, do I actually need to provide it with less context, because the model or the agent has actually got better at doing these things without the context? And as a result, am I just bloating context by adding this skill, or do I need to change the skill for this model? And I think it's that continuous evaluation of our environment that we need to do on a regular basis to say, what do I need to change?
Yeah.
Is it the context? Is it my prompts? Is it my harness because of an agent change?
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's something that's very commonplace then within Anthropic.
Yeah, so I think when we're testing these new models, especially on the applied AI side, because we're working closely with customers, we'll, in our early stages of testing, like really look out for what are these changes in behavior that we need to prompt around, and like where are the areas that we can be a bit more relaxed about now because the model is just better. So we'll always like come out with some guidance on like what are the best practices for working with this new model, and help customers with those migrations as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of helpful resources that we'll always publish around model releases to help people make sure that they can like move over really easily.
Hey everyone, hope you're enjoying the episode so far. Our team is working really hard behind the scenes to bring you the best guests so we can have the most informative conversations about agentic development. Whether that's talking about the latest tools, the most efficient workflows, or defining best practices. But for whatever reason, many of you have yet to subscribe to the channel. If you're enjoying the podcast and want us to continue to bring you the very best content, please do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really does make a difference and lets us continue to improve the quality of our guests and build an even better product for you. All right, back to the episode.
Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned very briefly a while back about how the marketing team, for example, created an app, which is wonderful. And I think Claude Tag really makes this easier and empowers people because, you know, folks who are non-technical or rather outside of the engineering team are probably much more comfortable engaging and interacting with an agentic coding environment when they're doing it through Slack. How has Anthropic used Claude Code, Claude Tag outside of the traditional engineering spaces? Yeah,
in just so many ways, honestly. I think every team, like the whole company, is running on the rails of Claude. Like ultimately, another like fun stat is in the last year, the amount of work which we as a company are comfortable delegating to Claude across all teams has doubled. So it's gone up from like 30 to like 60% in terms of like where we're able to rely on Claude. So yeah, the marketing one is fun. That one was like a pipeline for like ad generation or like copy generation. We have a lot of our like incident response infrastructure also relies on Claude to some extent to like triage things and like loop in the right people. And where it can kind of like start to diagnose like code problems, etc. So all of these different solutions rely on slightly different configurations of your agent. So like, for example, on sales, on our sales teams, we have like weekly briefs that Claude kind of like runs over what everyone did that week and gives you all of the stats and dashboard updates so that everyone's ready for the meeting and nobody had to like labor over those slides. So that's one thing that just like runs on a schedule. It's just like so clearly a time save for everybody. And then there's other things that are more responsive, like these incident response things where Claude knows when to jump in, it knows how to, like proactive to be. So that we really see like all flavors of these things. Like I, for example, when I'm developing products, I'll have like interfaces where I can like type feedback into prototypes and then just like Claude Code will just like work on those in the background. So everyone builds their own tooling in this sense. And I think a lot of this has gone into how we've thought about that development of Tag then, which is Claude Tag, which is meant to be really accessible across the board for all teams. And for example, like that proactivity thing is something you can really dial up and down. So you can have everything from like Claude only responds when it's tagged, or Claude creates a schedule on which it runs its tasks, or Claude like will proactively jump into threads here when it thinks that it's got relevant context to share. And what we've learned from like previous products like Claude Code, and also on our managed agents is like what works well in terms of this like scheduling and like knowing how proactive to be, because the worst thing in the world is a bot that responds to everything with kind of annoying context. Like we see this proactivity thing as a real spectrum, and we've like kind of really tuned it over time so that it kind of knows what's appropriate, where to jump in and when not to, and when to do things on a programmatic schedule. And that's something that you can also steer as a team. Like if Claude does something that you think is not aligned with your preferences, you can just tell it and it will update its memory and behave more similarly to what you want in the future.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, thinking back to a previous episode that we ran, of something which Olivier Pimel, the CEO of Datadog, was talking about how, you know, is us humans getting up at 3 a.m. because of a critical issue, how long is that actually going to last for?
Yeah.
How much do we trust agents to go ahead and, on an incident, actually, go ahead, make a fix that could be reversible, hopefully will be reversible.
Yeah.
And then maybe in the morning we wake up, notice something had happened and choose if it's the right way of doing something, perhaps reverse it, do it a different way. But we can rely upon agents to do this. And thinking about what you were saying, I kind of like envision this space whereby we have observability data, which is maybe even going into Slack, providing information. And then I can see something like Claude Tag looking at something like that. And then when it realizes something is perhaps a little bit off, looking to say, oh, should I raise the incident? And you almost like have an agent like Claude Tag saying, oh, actually, I am going to raise an incident here, and then I'm going to make some changes, document what I'm doing, make my change, push that. It feels like this is actually, I'd love to actually experiment with this now and actually see if that's an interesting path. Is that something you do at Anthropic?
So yeah, the incident response agent is definitely a pattern that we see working really well. And as somebody who used to be an engineer who was on call, I know the fear of the PagerDuty call coming through at 3 a.m, and it's not a nice one.
Yeah.
But I think this is a really interesting one, which plays on a couple of important design principles. Like, one is how much. First of all, like, for this agent to do a good job, you need to give it good access to different data sources. So like your data warehouse, potentially like whatever logging and metrics you have, and also potentially your repository so that it can start to diagnose things. This is like a very good starter kit, I think, for that kind of agent. But the other thing that's really important, and actually something which feeds into how we've designed our managed agents product, is where do you want to design those gates between like human agent interaction.
Yes.
So it's really up to teams, and we totally understand that rolling these things out at scale needs this like journey of trust that you need to go on. So like maybe when you start doing this, you just like let Claude have a go, and you also like keep your traditional process, and you just like check that on whatever like success threshold it did what you wanted it to. And then over time you like get more confident like delegating more and more of that work over. Or maybe it just starts like diagnosing fixes and passing that over to engineering team, waking them up if they think it's critical enough, to like potentially starting to raise a draft PR, to like whatever other like gates of access you want. So I think this is just like one of those where you can really see the value for like engineering teams of like this being less of a problem and helping you resolve incidents much faster, which is definitely what we've seen internally. And it just needs you to like carefully think about like, where do you want Claude to ask for your approval on these things?
Yeah.
And that's something that is, teams themselves should think about and configure. We can suggest like what we've seen work well, but it's I think it's obviously a high trust.
Yeah, it's funny actually. On my previous laptop, I used to have a sticker that said, AI works while I sleep, and now I'm kind of like, there will be we'll break through that trust barrier, and it will be AI fixes production while I sleep, and it's the right path. I think it's in terms of diagnosing, in terms of getting root causes, Agentic, agents will find that data more accurately, quicker, I think, and the loss of the outage, it's more expensive sometimes when you look at it from the cost of an outage. To have a human, diagnose, find the root cause, propose a fix, et cetera. So there's definitely an interesting balance there that we're going to see. It's going to be fascinating to see that shift.
Definitely. And I think in any case, I would much rather be woken up with a call that's like, hey, there was this incident. I think this is the PR that fixes it. Here's the tests I ran to verify that's the case. Like, this is the blast radius. I'd much rather that was what I wake up to than like, please, can you like look at this incident and figure out what happened?
With a time pressure of
exactly. So even if you still have that human gate, I think that like that information handover looks quite different in the two cases. So I'd happily like approve that PR at 3 a.m.
Absolutely. So Lamis, you gave a wonderful session at AI Native DevCon London just a number of weeks ago actually, and in fact we have AI Native DevCon in New York, which was announced. That's going to be happening in November 2026. So take a look at that as well. And now you mentioned a concept called dreaming, which was super curious. First of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about dreaming, what it is?
Yeah, of course. So dreaming is a research preview feature that we have on our managed agents offering. And for those who aren't familiar with managed agents, it's Claude Managed Agents. This is a product which essentially allows you to build and deploy agents much faster in production. So we take on a lot of the everything from kind of managing the harness of your agent on Anthropic side to some of the infrastructure and the observability, etc. And what we're really doing with this product is taking all the learnings that we've got from building these agents over some period of time and building them into like really concrete primitives like agents and environments and sessions that allow you to quickly compose those agents and deploy them really fast. So that's the managed agents product. And of course, given how important context has been as a concept in agentic development, it wouldn't be complete without a memory feature. So this allows agents to read and write to different memory stores as they learn things. And that's like very well access gated. So there's like huge organization level context, which is really important and like can only be read from, to like agent scratch pads that allow them to drop context about the work that they're doing, which is just amazing in terms of enabling their work. And like I said, people often ask about like, well, what is the best practices for structuring these memory systems? This really starts to run the risk as you run it over longer periods of time that there's like stale information in there, some stuff has gone out of date, there's missing information, it's just confusingly written, etc. And so what we designed and introduced is this concept called dreaming, which is kind of what it sounds like, I suppose, where essentially you are able to run these dreaming jobs at whatever cadence you like, where you input some of your memory stores and some of your session transcripts from managed agents. So these are basically basically the traces of how your agents have gone and carried out a couple of tasks. And you give this all to another agent, and it basically reviews those transcripts and it reviews the memories and it looks for any kinds of discrepancies. So maybe it finds that some information is missing that the agents would have performed better if they had that context, or vice versa, that there's something misleading in there, which is degrading performance. Or it just finds a new way to kind of reorganize that information to make it easier to search and surface for the agents. And it does this all in like a pretty pretty extensive manner. Like it gives you hypotheses for what to change, gives you attachments to the sessions where it thinks that the evidence is there. And then you can basically decide which of those changes to implement. And I think what's really important here is like this really opens the path towards continual learning. Like this idea that you can run your agents on one day and then based on whatever could have been optimized, you can run them the next day and actually see that they get better. And with dreaming, you can kind of hand over that kind of to a large degree, like allow that process to run in an automated fashion and then just approve whatever you think is relevant. So it's something we're really excited about, and we've seen a bunch of customers just see much better performance improvements with their deployed agents when they run processes like this.
Amazing. And for folks in the audience who want to learn more, your talk is actually online. Yes. So we'll make sure we link the audience to that, and you can see Lamis's session in full.
And yeah, just to add another point there, I guess, I mean, it was such a delight to be there that day. And I think, like we said about FOMO with features, it's nice to have the opportunity to speak about one of those like more complicated features potentially that people have less opportunity to use. So yeah, I hope folks that find that enjoyable.
Absolutely. It was people loved the session. We got amazing feedback about your session. So thank you very much for that. So why don't we're running out of time, but we should wrap. I'd love, we always love, giving practical advice and practical things that our listeners can do. So what would you say is something that you would say for folks who are maybe, trying to introduce maybe it's managed workflows, introducing agentic development further in their organizations. What would you say are some day-to-day practices that people can do from your experience that will massively unlock the next stage for folks?
Yeah, of course. And I think just like thinking about, potentially broad audience here, I would really encourage people to like go and set up Claude Tag and give it a try. You just need to get your Slack admin to turn it on and do some of the configuration, but it really doesn't take long. And to give you a flavor of the things that I'm doing with this, so the first thing I set up was a daily briefing. And because of the connectors and context that Tag has access to, it's able to tell me about things that happened over the past 24 hours, especially working with international teams, like things that my teams who are in San Francisco did. It just like immediately surfaces that all to me. So I don't have to wake up to like a wall of like emails and Slack messages, but I just have a nice curated brief about what needs my attention. It has context on my ongoing workflows as well. So it can tell me like, this thing that I'm working on, maybe this talk, like maybe you want to review these documents before doing that, etc. So daily brief is great. And then something else I have set up is it knows like which channels are important to me, and it pings me about anything urgent that needs my attention on a live basis. So anything it sees that like thinks is relevant to me, it will tell me about, and that's great because whilst working in public as a company is fantastic, it means there's a lot of things going on Slack, and I cannot keep on top of that.
Yeah.
And then some other things, like on a team level, what we have is like Tag will do like weekly reports on various things. So on the applied AI team, we have a weekly report of like, here's different things that the team learned and saw this week, which is really nice. Encourages people to kind of keep sharing that context and really scales that knowledge across the organization. So that's cool in terms of like best practices. And yeah, I think these are a couple of good places to get started.
Yeah.
And I think you'll very quickly get a feel for what the kind of capability of that is. One final flourish you can do is like ask Tag to build some custom software for you, and it can deploy it into like Claude Code artifacts, and then you can kind of share that as even maybe just a personal dashboard, or you can share it with your team and be like, hey, this is something to track XYZ workflow that we have.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are some good places to get started.
Amazing. And it's actually super timely because just this week, I'm a big fan of things like getting things done and those types of workflows. And one of my biggest areas of trouble of doing those types of things is the reviews and the check-ins. And so what I did was I created an app which I've deployed, and it essentially does very similar. It looks through my Slack, it looks through my email, it looks through my to-do lists, and it also looks through my Granola notes as well.
Amazing.
For my meetings.
Yeah.
And it will add a whole bunch of to-dos and extracting that from Granola, and it'll essentially say, oh, here are some things that you should be aware of or should add to your calendar. It adds them in. It's kind of like a little bit like my EA as well. And I tell you what, that's really unlocking productivity. So I totally am on board with those reviews, weekly reviews, monthly reviews, and daily check-ins and reflections. It's a real game changer from a productivity point of view.
Yeah, no, definitely give it a go with Claude Tag. And
I need to switch to Claude Tag and try.
See how it goes.
Yeah.
Some of the ones I really like as well are like just getting these agents to like tell you what you did well that week. Like that's a really nice thing sometimes that you don't have time to reflect on. Just like tell me like 3 wins I had this week. Tell me a couple of reflections on things I could like optimize, etc. But sometimes like you don't have time to reflect on those things, and in the world of AI, a lot is happening very quickly. It's nice to be able to take moments to reflect on what's going on.
And what I also do is I actually also put I've just recently had an annual, so what I do is I put my annual feedback in, as well as other things that I feel like my management team and things like that would want of me, and it also gives me feedback based on what I'm doing. Am I taking my next steps in improvement? Am I doing what the team are needing from me, and those types of things, which are actually really valuable in terms of you're doing what you want, and actually other people, their needs are also being satisfied by some of the stuff that you're doing. So I don't know. So all I need is an agent to just do my work as well, and then I can just let it go on.
We can just
whatever. we can go enjoy the sun.
Yeah.
Amazing. Lamis, this has absolutely flown by. It's been an incredible discussion. I very, very much thank you, not just for AI Native Dev Session, which was, like I say, was very well received, but absolutely wonderful and fascinating conversation. So I really, really appreciate you joining us. And thanks for all the insights as well as to how Anthropic are using Claude Tag, Claude Code, things that you've learned. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's been an absolute blast as well. And thank you so much for having me.
Amazing, Lamis. Thank you so, so much. I'm sure our audience absolutely loved that discussion. Tune into the next episode. Bye for now.
The AI Native Dev is brought to you by Tessel, the package manager for skills and context. Your hosts are Guy Pajani and me, Simon Maple. Our producer is Tom Dowler. The AI Native Dev is not just a podcast, it's a community, and we host monthly meetups at the Tessel offices in central London. Visit tessel.io/community to learn more, and I hope to see you there.